September 10, 1944. West bank of the Moselle River near Dornot, France. Rain slams sideways across the shattered tree line. The river below twists in a violent gray churn, its surface ripped by wind and the concussions of German mortar fire. Wet earth trembles with every blast. The air tastes of mud, cordite, and river spray. Men crouch low in the reeds, rifles pressed to their chests, helmets ringing from the constant hiss of shrapnel flying overhead. An engineer from the 150th Engineer Combat Battalion fights the current with a rope line wrapped around his shoulder, boots slipping on slick stones as he tries to anchor a section of timber against the rising water. Another soldier yells a warning as a German round snaps through a tree trunk, sending bark fragments across his face. The weather should have been their shield, but the enemy is dug deep on the heights across the river, firing blind through the storm and hitting more than they miss. Colonel Michael P. Hall moves among the men without ceremony, soaked to the bone, coat plastered against him by the gale. He keeps his head low, not out of fear but focus. Every few steps he stops to feel the tension on a cable or study the angle of a pontoon that threatens to tear free. The ground shakes again as another shell lands upstream, sending a plume of cold water that rains back down on his helmet. He wipes nothing away. He just keeps moving. Somewhere behind the tree line, a squad of infantry from the 5th Infantry Division huddles behind a collapsed stone wall. One soldier presses a field radio handset to his ear, trying to hear through the static as headquarters demands an update on why the crossing has not begun. A tank destroyer of the 607th Tank Destroyer Battalion growls nearby, its engine idling as the crew waits for news that the engineers have built something strong enough to support them. But all they can see is the river, raging and swollen, mocking every attempt to tame it. The first attempt at a crossing early that morning had ended fast and violently. Assault boats were overturned by the current before they reached the midpoint. A machine gun on the opposite bank stitched a deadly line across the water, turning men into silhouettes swallowed by the river. Now the remains of those boats drift downstream, splintered and waterlogged, as if reminding every man on the shore what failure looks like. Hall bends over a canvas map spread on the hood of a mud-splattered jeep, rainwater forming tiny pools across its surface. He studies the currents, the angles, the points where the far bank briefly dips in elevation before rising again. Engineers cluster around him, shivering, waiting. He doesn't raise his voice. He speaks calmly, measured, even as German mortars bracket the area closer and closer. A runner from 3rd Army headquarters arrives, ducking as a shell bursts behind him. He carries a message tube. Patton wants movement. The armor meant to drive deep into German-held Lorraine is stalled on this side of the Moselle, burning precious hours in a campaign built on speed. Every delay threatens the momentum that 3rd Army has fought to maintain since breaking loose from Normandy. The runner barely gets out his report before a machine gun opens up from across the river. Bullets skip across the water like metal stones, punching into the embankment. Men scatter. Hall stays exactly where he is, both hands on the map, watching the pattern of incoming rounds. He is not reckless. He is calculating. He listens to the rhythm of German fire and the roar of the storm and treats both as problems to be solved rather than threats to be feared. When the shooting pauses, he folds the map carefully and steps back toward the river, boots sinking into mud so thick it threatens to steal them from his feet. Engineers wrestle with a loose pontoon section bucking in the current. Hall wades into the water up to his knees, grips the line with both hands, and helps drag it into alignment. A second man joins him, then 2 more. For a moment it feels like the current will rip them all off their feet. Then the pontoon slips into place and the men collapse onto the bank, gasping for breath. Artillery whistles overhead. Someone yells, "Incoming." The blast lands close enough to shower them with river mud. Hall wipes his eyes with the back of his glove and scans the river again. The storm is growing worse. The wind cuts across the surface, stretching the water into jagged waves that hammer the pontoons. The far bank is a blur of muzzle flashes and dark movement. The Germans believe the river will break any crossing attempt. The weather is helping them, but Hall studies the river the way a craftsman studies raw material, searching for the shape hidden inside it. He kneels, feeling the vibration of the current through the ground. The storm, for all its brutality, is not only a danger, it is also cover. If the river can be forced into working with them instead of against them, there may be a way across. Not the way written in manuals, not the way the engineers trained for, something different, something unorthodox. Another burst of fire ricochets off the metal pontoons. Men shout, the wind howls, the river surges. Hall stands slowly, his uniform dripping, his eyes fixed on the water as if he sees a path no one else can yet imagine. Rain still lashes the west bank as Hall steps back from the river, boots sinking again into the slurry of mud and shattered roots. The storm rolls overhead with a low, grinding rumble, the kind that presses into a man's chest and makes every breath feel heavier. Behind him, the engineers gather in a loose semicircle, waiting for direction while trying to stay low beneath the erratic bursts of German fire. A messenger jeep brakes hard on the embankment, wheels spinning in the muck. Major Lorne Jeffers of 3rd Army steps out, collar pulled high, map case clutched tight. He doesn't shout, his voice wouldn't carry in this gale anyway. Instead, he moves close enough that Hall can hear him over the wind. General Patton wants the crossing operational. Today, no delay, no excuses, Hall nods once, rain running down the brim of his helmet. Patton's reputation for speed is no myth, and every man here knows the 3rd Army's drive is built on momentum. Lose that momentum and the Germans will have time to regroup, dig in, reinforce the Siegfried Line, and turn Lorraine into a maze of killing zones. Patton is pushing east with the fury of a man racing a clock no one else can see. And right now the Moselle stands in his way. The Germans have read the terrain with their usual discipline. Higher ground on the far bank, overlapping machine gun nests, mortars zeroed on the likely crossing points. They are convinced the Allies will not risk a major river assault in conditions like this. The rain has turned the Moselle into a violent, twisting mass of water, rising faster every hour. Even German officers with binoculars and field telephones believe the Americans must wait for calmer weather. They assume the river will buy them days. Hall kneels again in the mud, drawing a line in the soil with a gloved finger as Jeffers leans in. He traces the curvature of the river, shows the points where the current accelerates in a narrow chute, shows a shallow bend where the banks slope into a brief natural shelf. The kind of detail that only becomes useful when time is running out, and there are no safe plans left. Hall's voice stays low, steady. He explains that the standard bridging manuals forbid construction in currents this strong. Regulations demand slower water, clearer skies, stable banks. The Moselle offers none of that, but regulations were written for ordinary conditions. The 3rd Army does not have ordinary conditions. It has hours, maybe less, before German reinforcements tighten their hold on the eastern approaches. A shell lands close enough to knock loose branches from the trees behind them. Jeffers flinches. Hall keeps tracing the river line. He outlines something that sounds less like a formal bridge plan and more like a battlefield gamble, using pontoons differently than prescribed. Anchoring them on the near bank first, then letting the storm's own force swing the line into place like a hinge. Building from the far bank inward rather than the usual method, using the violence of the current not as an obstacle but as propulsion. Jeffers stares at the muddy drawing, trying to imagine it, trying to see how a bridge can be built by letting the river push it instead of resisting it. Hall watches his eyes and knows the moment he understands. There is no other choice. Artillery thunders again, farther upriver this time, but the tremor cuts through the ground. Engineers glance anxiously toward the heights. The Germans are searching, adjusting. They know something is brewing, they just don't know what. Patton's armored elements are massed a few hundred dunde yards behind the tree line, concealed as best they can be. Columns of M4 Sherman tanks stand idle, engines off, crews sheltering beneath ponchos and tarps while rain pools in the hull seams. The armor is a sleeping fist ready to strike, but without the bridge it's useless weight. Every minute they stay idle is a minute German commanders can use to reposition their anti-tank guns or bring in fresh reserves from Metz. A lieutenant from the 150th Engineers runs up with a soaked notebook, shouting over the wind. His men have measured the current again. Faster than expected, the river has risen another few inches. The storm is worsening. The standard pontoon moorings won't hold. Hall listens without blinking. The worse the conditions, the more unexpected the solution. The Germans won't believe an American engineer would attempt a crossing in this weather precisely because no manual says he should. That doubt is the narrow window they have. From the far tree line, a single German machine gun opens up, firing blind through the rain. Tracer rounds streak across the river like furious sparks. They strike the water near a half-submerged assault boat from the morning's failed attempt, sending up sharp bursts of spray. The engineers flatten. Hall stays crouched over the mud map. He erases a section of his drawing with his palm and redraws a steeper angle for the anchor lines. He shifts the position of the first pontoon. He adjusts the cable path so the storm-driven current will help set the structure rather than tear it apart. His hand moves with certainty, as if he has been studying this river not for hours but for years. Jeffers nods. He understands now. This is not about building a bridge the right way. This is about building the only bridge that can exist under conditions the enemy refuses to believe are survivable. Hall rises. The engineers gather around him, cold, exhausted, waiting for orders. He gives them the plan. The engineers lean in, rain hammering their helmets as Hall steps toward the riverbank, pointing with a gloved hand at the roiling water. His voice cuts through the storm with the steady authority of a man who has already run every outcome through his bunt and discarded anything that ends in failure. The plan he lays out is short, sharp, and entirely unconventional. They will not fight the storm, they will harness it. The first pontoon raft will be assembled on the near bank, lashed together faster than doctrine allows with minimal bracing. Instead of pushing it across by manpower or boat tugs, they will anchor one end with a reinforced cable and let the river swing the structure out like a barn door caught in a gust. The current will carry it toward the far bank, pivoting around the anchor point. The engineers must stabilize it the moment it touches the opposite shore. No hesitation. No delay. Seconds will matter. A few men exchange looks. It goes against everything they have trained for. But Hall's calm confidence steadies them. The river is too strong to fight, so he will make the current do the heavy work. Hall signals to Captain Ray Norwood, commander of one of the engineer companies. Norwood nods and moves toward the equipment trucks, shouting orders. Men spill out into the rain, hauling coils of cable, toolkits, and planks slick with river mud. They unfasten pontoon sections that clatter onto the ground like hollow metal drums. 3 men carry a gasoline-powered winch toward the bank, its sputtering engine coughing as they try to get it started. German artillery cracks again from the ridge overlooking the river. 2 shells whistle overhead and detonate farther behind the tree line, churning up mud and shattered branches. The engineers flinch, but keep working. This is expected. The enemy knows the Americans want a crossing here. but they still believe the weather is too savage for any real construction. Their barrages come irregularly, lacking the intensity of a coordinated defense. Hall counts on that. He moves to the stacked pontoon sections, running his hand along the riveted seams, checking for cracks or warping. The storm has already battered them. The river will finish the job if the engineers make even a small mistake. He forces himself to see every failure point before it happens. Sergeant Frank Delaney jogs up, wiping rain from his eyes. He reports that the cables are ready, anchors too. Hall nods and motions for him to follow. Together they climb the slippery slope toward a heavier truck parked under the trees. Inside is the thick steel cable Hall requested, strong enough for tank towing, heavy enough to hold against the Moselle's fury. Delaney and two others begin pulling it out, their muscles straining as the coil unravels like a metallic serpent. The wind surges, bending the branches overhead. The smell of wet wood mixes with exhaust fumes from idling vehicles. Somewhere behind them, a medic shouts for a stretcher team, another man cut open by splinters from a near shell burst. The storm drowns his voice, turning everything into a chaotic chorus of noise. Engines, rain, shouted commands, distant gunfire. Hall walks back to the river and crouches to examine the bank. Mud sloshes under his boots as he digs into the earth with a trenching tool, checking if the ground will hold the anchor stakes. It won't. The soil is too waterlogged. Anchors would rip free the moment the river catches the pontoon line. He stands up and scans the tree line. His eyes settle on a cluster of half-buried concrete from an old French defensive position. Remnants of pre-war construction. He motions sharply to Delaney. They will drive the cable's primary anchor into the concrete instead of the soil. It's the only thing on this shore strong enough to absorb the strain. Delaney barks the order. Engineers swarm toward the ruins with sledgehammers and wedges, preparing a slot to feed the cable through. It is brutal, exhausting work, but it has to be done before the river rises further. Hall checks his watch. The hands glow faintly in the gray light. Time is slipping fast. Norwood returns to him, rain streaming down his cheeks, reporting that the first pontoon assembly is almost complete. The men are working faster than the Germans expect, faster than they believed possible an hour ago. Speed is survival. A burst of rifle fire erupts from the far bank. German sentries have spotted movement through the storm. Their rounds crack across the surface of the river, striking sparks from the rocks near the engineers. Men hit the ground instinctively. Hall remains kneeling, tracing the final steps of the plan in his mind. They must swing the first pontoon out within minutes of anchoring the cable. Once it touches the far shore, teams will surge across in assault boats under the partial cover of darkness and storm to secure a foothold. The rest of the bridge will follow in a desperate sequence of timed construction. Any stall will leave the whole structure vulnerable. Another shell lands, closer this time. The concussion sucks the air from the lungs of every man nearby. Dirt and smoke swirl through the rain. Hall rises slowly, the wind pressing against him, and signals for the engineers to bring the pontoon forward. They grunt and strain as they push the metal structure toward the water's edge, boots sliding in the mud. The heavy raft groans under its own weight. This is the moment when the plan becomes real. Hall steps beside the pontoon, his hand resting on its cold metal surface, watching the river surge and heave before him. He has given his men an impossible design. Now they must make it live in the worst conditions of the campaign. The engineers shove the first pontoon into the shallows, their boots sinking to the ankles as the cold water surges around them. The raft bucks immediately, the river trying to wrench it away like a living thing. Hall steps in beside them, the icy current slamming against his legs, the storm howling so loud it erases every other sound except the pounding of his heartbeat. Delaney hauls the steel towing cable across the bank, shouting for slack. Two men brace themselves against the concrete ruins as they feed the line through the improvised anchor slot. The winch team signals readiness. Hall nods, raising an arm. The winch coughs to life, its engine sputtering under the rain but holding steady. The steel line tightens with a sharp metallic whine. The pontoon lurches, the river wants to swallow it whole. Men scramble to stabilize it, hooking their arms through rope handles, boots braced hard against the slippery stones. German machine gun fire erupts again from the ridge, bullets cracking through branches and kicking up plumes of water near the raft. A young engineer slips, plunges waist deep into the torrent, but two others grab him by the webbing straps of his gear and haul him back. Hall grips the cable with both hands and feels its vibration. The river is pushing harder than the calculations predicted. He studies the angle of the pontoon, watching how the bow dips into the current and rises again. The storm's rhythm is unpredictable, but he can sense a pattern beneath the chaos. He waits for the next surge, counts the seconds between gusts of wind, listens to the thunder rolling across the heights. The moment arrives. He gives the order. The men release their hold, the winch locks. The pontoon snaps outward, the steel cable groaning as it absorbs the strain. For a second, it looks as if the raft will flip. The current grabs it and swings it downstream, pivoting around the anchored line exactly as Hall calculated. The engineers watch, breath held, as the structure turns broadside to the river, catching the full force of the storm. Then it stabilizes. The cable holds. Hall sprints along the bank, shouting for the far shore team. Norwood waves a signal. 4 assault boats, previously hidden beneath camouflaged netting and branches, are dragged to the waterline. The infantry inside them move with grim determination. Men of the 5th Infantry Division check their M1 rifles, tighten chin straps, and prepare to push off the moment Hall gives the word. The pontoon carried by the river drifts toward the far bank. It smashes against a submerged rock, sending a shower of water skyward. The engineers wince, but the raft holds together. They built it fast, rough, and under fire, but they built it strong. On the east bank, German flares hiss upward, bright white arcs cutting through the rain. The enemy finally realizes the Americans are making a serious attempt. A machine gun opens up from a bunker half hidden in the trees. The tracers slice across the surface, searching for targets. An engineer collapses beside Hall, his helmet knocked clean off by a glancing hit. Medics drag him back toward the tree line. The rest of the men keep moving. Delaney yells that the secondary anchor cables are ready. Hall waves him forward. They must reinforce the primary line before the pontoon reaches the opposite shore. Otherwise, the strain could snap the cable and send the entire structure downstream. Delaney and his men run through the mud, carrying coils over their shoulders as shells detonate farther upriver, spraying fragments across the water. Hall watches the pontoon closely. It's drifting perfectly for the narrow shelf he identified earlier. If the storm shifts, if the current changes, if the Germans land a lucky mortar hit, the entire effort could unravel. A deeper rumble rolls through the storm. Not thunder. Artillery. German guns find their range. A shell lands close enough to blast a hole in the river itself, water heaving upward in a column of white. The engineers drop flat. Hall stays low but never takes his eyes off the pontoon. His jaw tightens. The next shell lands closer. The raft shudders. Still it moves onward. Norwood rushes to Hall's side, pointing ahead. Through the haze and smoke, the pontoon is moments from touching the far bank. German silhouettes scramble along the ridge, trying to sight targets through the storm. Hall raises his arm. Launch the boats. The infantry surge forward. The assault boats crash into the river, bow first. Men row with frantic strength, fighting the current that tries to hurl them sideways. Water sloshes into the hulls, bullets snap overhead, but they push ahead, their faces set with the grim focus of men who know the success of the entire Third Army hinges on this moment. Hall watches the first boat reach the pontoon. The soldiers leap out, splashing onto the raft, then sprint toward the far shore as another mortar round explodes behind them. Mud, water, and smoke fill the air. No one hesitates. The pontoon slams into the shelf on the far bank. The river tries to shove it back, but the cable holds firm, vibrating like a living wire under the strain. The infantry fan out quickly, rifles firing into the tree line as they carve a foothold where none should exist. The impossible bridge has its first anchor point. Now the real construction begins. Rain sheets across the river as Hall gives the signal for the next set of pontoons. The men move with a frantic precision born of adrenaline and exhaustion, dragging the metal sections through the mud and into position. The far bank crackles with rifle fire where the infantry have established a thin, fragile foothold. Their muzzle flashes flicker like sparks against the darkened ridge. The river growls beneath the storm, waves slam against the anchored pontoon trying to tear it loose. Engineers brace it with long poles, boots slipping as they fight to keep the platform steady. Delaney's voice carries through the wind as he directs two crews to tighten the secondary cables. The steel lines groan, stretching under the weight of the river's rage. The next pontoon slaps the water with a hollow thud. Men leap onto it, securing lashings with numb fingers while German mortars thump in the distance. Plumes of water rise around them. The storm hides the enemy positions, but it also hides the engineers. Hall knows the weather is their shield and their tormentor, and every minute spent fighting the wind is a minute the Germans cannot aim with precision. A Sherman tank engine roars to life somewhere behind the tree line. Its lieutenant, crouched beneath a poncho, waits for the all clear that the bridge can bear the weight. The crews are restless. Their machines are built for forward motion, not idling in rain so heavy it runs in streams off the glacier's plates. Patton's insistence on speed hangs over them all like a commandment etched into steel. Hall steps onto the first pontoon section, water sloshing over the edges as he checks the alignment. He crouches, pressing his hand against the metal floor. It vibrates with the force of the river, but it holds firm. He motions to Norwood to bring the next section forward. The engineers push it in, linking the joints with practiced motions despite the chaos surrounding them. Lines are thrown across the gap. Men pull, strain, curse. The sections meet with a heavy clang. Bolts are driven home with hammer blows that disappear beneath thunder. The bridge grows. On the far bank, infantry push up from the shelf, climbing into the tree line as they engage bursts of German fire. Their shouts blend with the storm. One squad waves across the river, signaling that they have secured the immediate shoreline. Hall nods once, then calls for the third pontoon. A German machine gun opens up from a half-concealed nest in the ridge. Tracers rip across the river, striking sparks from the wet metal and sending men diving flat. A round clips the channel supporting the second pontoon. Another ricochets off Hall's helmet with a sharp metallic ring. He steadies himself on one knee as Delaney shouts for smoke. A team runs forward with smoke pots. They light them and hurl them into the river. Thick white plumes billow across the water, mixing with storm mist to create a shifting curtain that blinds the enemy. The machine gun fire falters, then stops. The engineers rise and get back to work. They know what's coming next. The first vehicle, a radio operator, sprints from the tree line and skids to a stop beside Hall. Rainwater streaming down his face, the armor commander wants confirmation. Is the bridge ready? Hall looks down the length of the unfinished structure. It's short, incomplete, battered by the storm. But the calculations in his mind are the same ones he ran in the mud hours ago. The river will carry the load differently than a static crossing. The pontoons will rise and fall, shifting under weight, but with the current pushing in the right direction. The structure will flex rather than collapse. He gives the answer. Bring them forward. The signal is passed back. Engines rev and the sound vibrates through the trees like a waking giant. The first M4 Sherman emerges from the cover of the forest, treads grinding through the mud, its headlight covers glisten with water. The tank commander pops his head from the hatch, scanning through the storm before dropping back inside. The tank rolls toward the bridge. Every engineer turns to watch. The weight of 30 tons feels like a threat, a dare, and a test all in one. The Sherman reaches the first pontoon, the metal groans, the bridge dips, water splashes up along the sides, the men hold their breath, the pontoon rebounds, holds, the tank moves forward inch by inch, the treads clattering against wet planks. Hall walks alongside it, hand on the cable, feeling the strain. The storm presses down on them all. German artillery booms across the river, shells falling blind. One explodes behind the tank, showering the bridge in mud and debris. The Sherman pushes on. Behind it, another tank moves into position, and another. On the far shore, infantry wave them forward, cheering over the storm as the first tank climbs, off the last pontoon and onto the mud of the eastern bank. Its engine growls triumphantly, turret swinging toward the ridge as the crew prepares to support the foothold. The impossible crossing is no longer theory or hope. It is happening. Line by line, section by section, under fire and storm, the bridge begins to carry the strength of Patton's Third Army across the Moselle. The second Sherman clatters across the pontoons, the whole structure flexing beneath the weight as rain pours in blinding sheets. Hall steps aside as the tank rumbles past, his boots sinking into the mud between the bridge fastenings. The steel cables tremble under strain but hold their course, guiding the armored wave toward the far shore. Each successful crossing tightens the engineers' confidence and loosens the grip of dread that has haunted them since dawn. On the east bank, the foothold secured by the infantry has grown into a fragile perimeter. Men of the 5th Infantry Division press forward from the shelf, moving tree to tree, rifles up, pushing the Germans back into the darkness of the ridge. M1 shots crack through the rain, countered by sharp bursts from German MP-40s. Shadows flicker between the pines. Someone shouts for a bazooka team as a German machine gun nest begins to rake the shoreline again, its muzzle flash stinging bright against the storm. The first Sherman crests the rise and fires. Its 75mm cannon sends a concussion through the wet air, the shell exploding against the ridge and silencing the nest in a single blast. The crew inside shout through the intercom, adrenaline carrying their voices as the tank pushes deeper into the tree line. Mud flies from the treads as they grind forward. The infantry cheer and surge behind it. Hall watches the fight unfold from the bridgehead. He sees the ridge flash again as another German position fires down toward the bridge, bullets whining across the water. The third Sherman is halfway across now, its hull rocking with every wave. A jeep carrying a radio team follows behind it, the driver leaning low over the wheel as he fights the slick wooden planks. Delaney runs up beside Hall, panting hard. The next pontoon section is ready. Hall nods. The fight on the far bank is widening. More armor needs to get across, more men, more ammunition. The bridge must grow with the battle, stretching its spine out across the river despite everything the storm and the enemy hurl at it. The engineers throw out lines and heave the next pontoon toward the gap. Waves slam against it as men struggle to guide it into position. A mortar round lands upstream, throwing water over them in a cold, drenching spray. The raft bangs against the anchored sections. Men grab hold, plant their boots, and drag it into place with raw, desperate force. Hall drops to one knee and checks the alignment, fingers pressed against the wet metal as he feels the vibration of the river beneath him. The currents are shifting, swelling, but the storm's fury is beginning to stabilize. The worst of the winds have passed. The river remains treacherous but no longer impossible. A burst of gunfire erupts from the tree line behind him as German skirmishers attempt to hit the bridge from an unexpected angle. Norwood orders a security team to intercept them. A squad from the 5th Engineers charges up the slope, rifles barking, driving the attackers back before they can find their mark. On the far bank, the 2nd Sherman joins the fight. Its machine gun sprays a hillside bunker where German riflemen crouch behind a stone wall. The infantry move up behind the armor using its bulk as a shield. Grenades arc through the rain. Explosions thunder through the ridge. The foothold widens another 10 yards. A runner from across the bridge waves a bright red cloth, signaling to Hall. More ground taken. The ridge nearest the shoreline is nearly clear. Hall wastes no breath. He signals for more vehicles. Engines rumble behind him as a column of half-tracks from the 90th Infantry Division moves into position to cross. Medical jeeps wait behind them, their canvas tops sagging under the weight of the rain, ready to bring wounded across in the opposite direction. The 3rd pontoon section locks into place with a heavy metallic thud. The engineers barely pause before turning to the next. Their hands are scraped, soaked, freezing, but none of them slow. Not while the bridge lives. Not while Patton's entire momentum surges across this narrow, fragile artery. Another Sherman rolls onto the bridge, its treads clanking, water splashing high against its sides. Hall walks past it, checking tension lines, his shoulder brushing the hull as it passes. The tank commander salutes him before disappearing back into the storm. On the far bank, the breakthrough is becoming unmistakable. The ridge that once seemed unassailable is burning with scattered fires as German units pull back under the pressure of armor and infantry working in tandem. Mortar crews abandon their pits. A field gun tries to reposition, but is caught in the open by a Sherman's machine gun. The crew scatters. Hall feels the river's breath against his face, cold and relentless, but no longer dominant. The bridge now carries the fight. The banks are linked by steel and grit, by men who refuse to let the storm decide the outcome. 3rd Army is crossing, and the Germans who believed the Moselle would buy them days now realize they are out of time. The ridge above the far bank glows with the last embers of the firefight as Hall steps onto solid ground. The storm has eased into a cold, steady rain, its fury spent, leaving the battlefield soaked and trembling beneath a low ceiling of smoke. The engineers who crossed with him now stand scattered among the trees, catching their breath, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion. The sounds of the Moselle's current drift up from behind them, no longer a roar, but a steady, relentless pulse. Shermans idle near the tree line, their engines ticking softly as crews perform quick checks before pushing deeper into the German-held interior. Infantry gather ammunition from the soaked crates ferried across the bridge. Stretchers move past Hall, carrying wounded men toward the waiting medics on the west bank. Every step is measured, careful, but the urgency of the day has faded. The far shore is theirs now. Hall walks down the embankment to the point where the pontoon bridge meets the land. The structure stretches behind him in a long, wavering arc, pontoons bobbing gently under the weight of vehicles still streaming across, half-tracks, jeeps, ammunition carriers, the veins of an army flowing east. He moves along the planks, boots landing with heavy thuds against the wet wood, and places a hand on one of the cables. It hums quietly beneath his glove, alive with tension but steady. Delaney approaches, limping slightly, a bandage tied around his forearm. He gives a tired grin, the cable held. Hall nods. He has no need to say more. The unlikely design conceived in mud and rain now lives as the artery of 3rd Army's advance. Along the far slope, Norwood and his men drive the last German pockets away from the riverbank, ensuring no counterattack can threaten the crossing. Their weapons hang low now, barrels steaming in the cool air. They search bodies, gather prisoners, and check the perimeter with practiced efficiency. The ground is littered with broken branches, spent casings, and the debris of abandoned German equipment. The storm washed some of it downslope, leaving it half buried in churned mud. Farther up the ridge, a Sherman turret turns slowly toward a distant grove as scouts report movement. But minutes later, the all-clear comes. The Germans have pulled back, stunned by the speed of the crossing. Their calculations, weather, terrain, readiness, were precise. But they were also predictable. They assumed the Americans would obey the storm's warning. Patton never obeyed warnings, and Hall refused to let the river dictate the timetable. As the bridge continues to carry vehicles across, Patton himself arrives on the west bank, his presence unmistakable even from a distance. His long coat snaps in the wind as he stands with a cluster of staff officers, binoculars raised. He studies the bridge, the crossing, the ridge, the hundreds of men who forced the impossible into reality. Hall knows he will cross soon once security is confirmed. The general moves like a man already deep in the next phase of the battle, his eyes fixed beyond the horizon. Hall turns back toward the east bank. The storm clouds are breaking apart, revealing pale afternoon light that filters through the drifting smoke. It paints the water in thin streaks of silver. The river is still swollen and dangerous, but its authority has been shattered. It is no longer a barrier. It is a conquered element of the battlefield. Norwood jogs down the slope, stopping beside Hall. His breath forms faint clouds in the cooling air. The men are asking how the bridge held, he says, how the river didn't tear it apart. Hall glances at the pontoons, the lines, the anchors buried deep in the concrete ruins. Then he looks at the rows of muddy, exhausted engineers, each of them still working despite shaking hands and soaked uniforms. "Tell them the river wanted to fight," he replies. "We just fought harder." Norwood laughs, quietly, with the kind of relief that only comes after surviving something that should have killed them all. Evening settles slowly across the river as more units cross, stretching Third Army deeper into German territory. Orders begin to spread through the battalions, push toward the next village, secure road networks, prepare for counterattacks. But all of that is made possible by the span of wet, battered metal beneath their feet. Hall walks the length of the bridge one last time before turning toward the eastern shore to rejoin his men. The storm has left the river heavier, darker, but in its surface he sees the reflection of the crossing. Every risk taken, every calculation made under fire, every man who held the line when the current tried to tear it from their grasp. The Moselle, once thought impossible to cross in such conditions, now lies behind the Third Army as a testament to the will of the engineers who defied it. And Hall knows that in the days ahead, as Patton's forces surge deeper into German defenses, commanders will speak of the crossing as a turning point, a moment when speed triumphed over expectation and an improvised bridge changed the tempo of a campaign. But on this riverbank, as the rain finally thins to a mist and the bridge sways gently under the weight of another passing Sherman, none of the men think of legacy. They think only of the storm they beat, the river they tamed, and the ground they now stood on. Taken not by chance but by grit,